I was asked, would he come down and photograph the punk night? Suddenly, the Clash come on and bang! There was this incredible cultural explosion going on.
It was a scary moment because punk could have gone either way. Some of the bands did have NF following.
The National Front were growing incredibly.
Keep our country free from invasion!
They're not English! They don't belong here!
We said what we need to do is do a gig, thing called Rock Against Racism.
We're against racism in all facets of British life.
We want rebel music, street music, music that breaks down people's fear of one another, music that knows who the real enemy is. Love music, hate racism. We're going to march from Trafalgar Square to Vicky Park. Get a stage, build it, got to have the Clash, absolutely great energy punk band. The police were ridiculing us, saying nobody's going to come to this march.
The numbers just kept coming.
In this society, we're made to feel powerless and useless, and that the great and the good should do our thinking for us. And one of the wonderful things that we did in RAW was to say, no, just ordinary people, we can do things, we can change the world.
Welcome to Soul Fest and welcome to an exclusive session here at the festival where we're going to meet the makers of a film showing in this year's festival called White Riot. White Riot tells the story. It's like it's almost like a superhero origin story. It tells the origins of the Rock Against Racism movement in the 70s. And we're joined for this exclusive session by the film's director, Rubika Shah, and by contributors to the film and pillars of that movement in the 70s, Mykaell Riley and Pervez Bilgrami. Welcome to Soulfest, guys. Thank you so much for being with us. Rubika, may I start with you? And just, can you tell us a little bit about how you kind of found your way into this story?
Absolutely. I'd seen the concert of the Clash at Victoria Park, and it struck a chord with me, not just because it was a great performance, but also because I just I hadn't heard of it. So I wondered, you know, how did all these people get to Victoria Park? Anyway, that bit's a bit boring, but then I quickly kind of delved in a bit deeper and found out that it was something called Rock Against Racism. And that really piqued my interest because, you know, I think back to the 70s or stories that I hear of the 70s, and I don't really hear that many positive stories about civil rights and about, you know, positive stories about race relations in the UK. So I started digging deeper and deeper, and I found out that there was a small group of people that literally worked in a print shop, you know, artists, photographers, creatives, who got together and they decided that they wanted to stand up against racism in the UK. And so, you know, 5 people seems, you know, it's just a very small group. And, you know, for it to then become something huge like the Victoria Park Carnival, I just thought this is a story that has to be told.
So Mykaell and Pervez, I really would like maybe to start with you, Mykaell, but help me understand a little bit about the backdrop to actually getting involved with Rock Against Racism. Can you help me understand a little bit of the scene at that time?
God, we're looking at late 70s, maybe, I don't know, 78. And it's a period in which British reggae has finally got a foothold. And by that, I mean, a few bands have got a major deal. Where roots reggae, where we've been working with a punk audience, and by working with a punk audience, just to expand on that, that was the youth at the time that was rioting against the government, state policy, legislation, deprivation, and racism. And it was complicated in that it was a period where I think both black and white youth was struggling with the concept of identity. It's different within the black community than it was in the white community, but these, for the large working class community who were suffering the same challenges from the government, we came together through music, and that music was punk and reggae. And it was in the very early stages of that coming together where the Rock Against Racism movement kicks in. But in my experience, it was also because most of the gigs I was doing at the time, and I was in Steel Pulse, I should say, most of the gigs we were doing, our audience was punk. But we also had a fascist movement who loved the music that would turn up as well. That is the challenge of identity at this period, which is, we can go into that later, but that was the complexity of that period.
I was very young. I'd have been like, when this was all happening, I was 4 and 5. So, you'll forgive me for not showing up to the gigs. Do you know what I mean? But I think what was really kind of striking for me about the film was the way in which it kind of brought it home and made it come alive a bit. And I think I was particularly struck because I didn't really understand much about your band, Pervez. And I'd really love to kind of know more about what your experience was like at the time and how you even began to go on that journey to being in a band.
Okay, yeah, it's a pretty plain story, really. I think the run up to Carnival, the preceding 10 years was a pretty dark period in this country. You'd seen Pell make his speech, the growth of the National Front, and we basically grew up with that. And so we grew up with new words coming into vocabulary like packy bashing. So 3-4 of us just felt that things had gone too far. And I think when I mean too far, it's not okay being beaten up. It's not okay. On a typical day, you'd leave for work, a woman would throw a bottle at you. You'd go to work with very, very educated people who would call you our tinted friend. You'd come home and find that your mother had been spat on. And we just said, we just can't take this anymore. So some of us started fighting back. And one of the main ways of fighting back was to protest against the National Front. So we went to picket them. In the 1979 election, we went to picket as many National Front meetings as we could. We went throughout the country. And as far as RA is concerned, we grew up in a way with RA. We were ordinary punters. So, for example, Mykaell's sitting there. I saw him from far away. He was on the stage with his Ku Klux Klan outfit. You're looking at, am I really seeing what I'm seeing? We saw the Clash, Tom Robinson. And then we decided that we'd get a bit more involved in it. So we started our own RA gigs. We progressed to being on the two of us on the central committee of RA. And we fought it from that angle because we basically had enough.
Yeah, I hear that. So I'd love to kind of talk to Rubika a little bit about the way in which you visualize this story.
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the first things actually that people pulled out when we went to interview them, or that they told us about rather, was the punk fanzine. And being a fan of fanzine culture from that era, I was surprised that I hadn't seen this fanzine called Temporary Hoarding. And they pull it out, and it was huge. It was like A3 and A3, 2 A3 size pages, and it's just full of graphics. And it also reported, the news that you didn't really hear about or that you don't think about from that era. And so, it married like politics and graphics and music and culture and all the things that young people are into. So, we were like, well, we have to have this in the film, and we have to try and animate it. So I worked with an animator actually on a short film called White Riot London that we made some time ago. And we actually practiced, that was a really great opportunity to practice out like how we would, reinterpret this kind of visual material. And so we created, you know, little, I guess, little montages with the graphics and, you know, having people doing voiceovers and also recreating it with archive, cutting out archive and footage, actual archive footage, and mixing that with the graphics. So that gave us a really good opportunity to practice what we were going to use in the feature.
Absolutely. It's really beautiful work. And I think one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you all about was like the phrase that kept coming to me when I was watching this film was like, lest we forget. You know, it kind of feels like there are real parallels in the story that's being related in this film and some of the things that we see going on today.
Well, it was absolutely something that we thought about. So I work really closely with Ed Gibbs, who's the co-creator of the project, writer and producer. And together, you know, I guess like everybody in Britain and around the world, actually, you know, we saw Trump being elected, we saw Brexit, we saw all these things happen over the last 5 years, and they're all, you know, contributed to, you know, our desire to make the film, you know, the urgency of the story to be told now. You know, and then the fact that we actually made it, you know, and what we've seen recently actually happen with Black Lives Matter and, you know, conversations about race again, you know, in the zeitgeist, in the media, and this film now being a part of that, I think is really great because, like you say, you know, we shouldn't forget the lessons of the past, and this is something that had been forgotten for such a long time, and hadn't really been acknowledged. You know, there's so many stories of positive stories of race relations in the 70s, and actually this is just one of them. And I hope that people do start looking at, you know, our history, our contemporary British history, with a new lens, and thinking about, you know, the experiences of different people, not just white British people.
Am I seeing this? Am I looking at this through a kind of rose-tinted glasses or whatever, and looking back nostalgically? To me, the vibe that I got from the film was that the communities, like the Asian community, the Black community, that are kind of, and the way that they're portrayed in this film, there seems to be a kind of a more common ground and a unity. Am I projecting? Is that something that was true of the time? Is that something that's kind of been lost along the way somewhere? I just wanted to know what you guys' feelings were on that.
In terms of concerts, again, it was a complicated period where people forget, but you did not have a mixed promotion. In other words, you had, if it was a reggae concert or a soul concert, that was promoted as such. You didn't have mixed bands. What Rock Against Racism brought forward was that coming together of Black and white musicians on the same bill. We now take it for granted, but we have to go back to that period. And it sounds odd, it sounds surreal, but that's where it actually came together. And lastly, I'd say that if we jump forward to where we are now, the parallel is youth. It was the youth that came out on the streets and said, not in our name, in terms of racism. It was a youth that marched to Victoria Park and turned up in unprecedented numbers, which was a shock to everyone, including the organizers of the concert, that, you know, there was this spirit of unity, and it was shown, it came together. So that says something, and for me, that is hopeful.
You know, looking back at that time and then looking at the decades that followed and seeing that there are real distinct parallels between what was happening in the 70s and what is happening now. I guess I wanted to know where are you on the spectrum? Are you hopeful about the future? Do you despair? Doing what you were doing in the 70s and then seeing what happened and followed that, and that obviously the prevalence of the National Front, the acceptability of those thoughts in public kind of diminished in the time after the 70s. And I wonder how you feel about things now and those parallels.
Okay, yeah, there are parallels. I live in the West End, and we during the lockdown, we've been going for long walks, and coincidentally on two running Sundays. First one was Black Lives Matter march, and we just came across it by accident. And I thought, I've seen this somewhere before. And then the following week, it was the Football Hooligans March, whatever you call them. And we came across them purely by accident. And then I suddenly thought, well, I've seen this somewhere before.
It's really interesting because the kind of the cyclical nature of this, the issues that come up in the film and some of the things that we see today. I wonder, what are the ideas that you would share with young people who are maybe seeing this film and coming to the realization that they're kind of stuck in the matrix, you know, and that it's a kind of a cycle. How do we break this cycle?
I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about actually is, and when I was making this film, so, you know, it's 40 years ago, isn't it? So 40 years before that was World War II, you know, 40 years since Ra is today, you know, it got me thinking. And I think that, you know, I'm hopeful because although we only move on a little bit, we move forwards a little bit within these cycles. But I think that bit that we move on, you know, like now, for example, we can talk about, you know, white privilege. You know, we're able to, I think, articulate how we feel. You know, I didn't see that in the 70s, in the late 70s. I saw a lot of violence and a lot of anger, but I didn't really see that level of kind of debate that we're having now, and maybe that we've been having for the last, you know, 10, 20 years. But now we're able, you know, people are able to go on television and talk about it and find the words to talk about it. And I think that's really important. So I hope that from this will be a springboard for change in that sense.
If I could just say that the fight is a very different fight. All of the basics are the same. When I was young, during the late 70s and early 80s, the way you fought back was you bought time out. You opened up the agitprop section. You looked up to see where the National Front were marching, where the anti-National Front people were going to be, and you went there. It was as simple as that. It was confrontation. You could see the enemy. These days, perhaps you can't see the enemy so much. So the fight is through social media, and I think sometimes there are very, very dark forces at work in social media, and the basics are still there. It's about racism, but the fact is the fight is a very different fight.
I would have to agree with that. It's got more nuance. I think what technology has done is it's created, between black and white, it's created more grey, which means you need you need to understand what you're up against. And I think one of the interesting things about where we are now is, if you're a young person, this never happened. It's a first for them. It's the first in their lifetime. And so the opportunity here is to connect the past with the present. There is hope, I think, because we're changing more minds at this point. The big challenge is, how long does this moment last? And what are the actions that come out of this moment? You know, will we simply reset and go back to where we were? And I hope not. I hope that the young people look at that stance that was taken back in the 70s and are empowered.
Yeah, I think it would be great to see, you know, the 2020, what the 2020 version of Rock Against Racism would look like today. I mean, it'd be wonderful to see like a bunch of young people organizing in that way and what that might look like. And I think that's a really kind of a hopeful point at which to kind of bring this kind of discussion to a close. But thank you. You know what? It's an incredible film. I really hope as many people get to see it in the festival as possible, because I think it's really a bit special and really kind of reminds us of, and gives us a bit of context for some of the things that we're experiencing today. So like, thank you guys for making it, and thank you for so much for letting it be part of S.O.U.L Fest.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.